Hey there, guys. What's going on? And welcome to the Barbells and BJJ podcast yet again with your host, Mr. George Cresswell. And today we're doing a scientific deep dive into a topic which has received a lot of widespread attention. A lot of people make big sweeping claims about it. There's a lot of people that claim and swear by it, that it's this miracle cure that tends to, cure all bodily ailments and promote perfect health in and of itself. And we're going to be going into a deep dive on cold water immersion. A little bit about what it is, maybe a little bit about why it works, particularly in the context of strength and hypertrophy. We're not going to be going into too much about, or really any, in this episode, about disease and anything like that, which I don't feel I'm qualified to speak on as of yet. I haven't done any big reading or research into that side of things. The last couple of days I've spent my time head down in research papers, quite literally. In particular, looking for the effects of cold water immersion on these outcomes. I've done reading on it in the past, but I've never brought it into a podcast episode like you're seeing now. So we're going to go over what evidence is there on cold water immersion, its potential effects on accruing, its potential effects on accruing muscle mass, and its potential effects on strength outcomes. To start off with, we're going to be looking at a meta-analysis from the authors Leeder and colleagues. I can't remember the other guys' names. You typically only remember the leading author's name. I'm sorry, that's a sad reality of science. And this came out back in 2012, and it's a meta-analysis, and they were looking at cold water immersion as a recovery modality. They had a strict inclusion criteria, and this is a little bit about what a meta-analysis is. It's a study of studies. They take typically human randomized control trials, as many as there are available, that fit a specific criteria depending on what they are looking at, what we call outcome variables are. And then we are able to take the results from those studies and pool them into one collective consensus value called an effect size. So that's where we take all the results from the studies and basically we, in a way, sort of make them into an average. We show what the averages of all the studies show. Obviously, some studies, they may show greater effects than others. Some studies might show slightly negative effects, but then we pool them all together. And this is why it's typically the top of the evidence hierarchy. As a result, this study had a mixture of men and women, and they had a mixture of elite and untrained individuals. I'm just ticking them off as I go along. I've made some notes on here because I want to make sure that I don't forget anything that I've written down. And also, we've got many, many more studies to come as well. Overall, there was 182 men and 57 women who were a part of this meta-analysis as a result of being part of one of the included studies. Overall, then, you had 239 participants. Various time points were able to be analyzed, all the way from baseline, which is the first time you ever do any testing procedures with your participants, and then all the way up to 96 hours, but also including 24, 48, and 72 hours. So very, very acute time frame, but this can be very, very important when you're looking at certain sports with multiple competitions and training sessions in a short space of time. They looked at cold water immersion on muscle soreness. Obviously, when you train and you create a lot of what we call exercise-induced muscle damage, or EIMD, that's typically where you get your delayed onset muscle soreness from, your DOMS, as it's also known. So they looked at the effect of cold water immersion on perceived muscle soreness in this time frame after the exercises were completed. They looked at an enzyme called serum creatine kinase, or CK. This is another indicator of muscle damage, though it isn't the strongest, and it's increasingly looking like it's going to be less and less used. in the future. But this is one of the ones we use this in my dissertation, for example. In fact, we used all of these measures aside from muscular strength in my dissertation. But basically what happens is, why it's being used as a measure, or why it has been used as a measure, is when muscle damage is high, this creatine kinase that normally is within the muscle leaks out into the bloodstream. So therefore, we detect higher levels of that in the bloodstream. We can see that there's a higher level of muscle damage. And that helps us inform not only the recovery intervention and how effective it was, but also how effective the actual exercise was at inducing the muscular damage that we wanted. So the main different ways that you can use this measurement. They also analyze muscle strength and muscular power. And then the water temperatures ranged from as low as 5 degrees centigrade up to 15 degrees centigrade. And water temperature is going to be very, very important, as we'll get on to with one of the later studies that we're going to be looking at today. The results section. So we have muscle soreness, or delayed onset muscle soreness. They revealed a moderate positive effect. So when you're looking at things like these, you'll either normally see a D value or a G value representative of what's called an effect size. And the effect size helps tell us basically how significant we're looking at an improvement as a result of the intervention. So if you have less than 0.2, and this is to do with stats, by the way. Less than 0.2, you're looking at a very small effect. Up to between 0.2 and I think it's 0.5 or 0.6 is a moderate size. The G value for this one was 0.525, and it was statistically significant. So we're looking at a moderate value, moderate effect size here. And then above this value, you're looking at strong effect sizes. And that would be things like, if we're looking at an effect size to do with body composition, it could be a difference of 0.9 effect size in people's muscle mass. That would theoretically be something that you'd be able to see with a visual assessment. You know, looking at two photos or looking at two people, you'd be able to easily point out that one's more muscular than the other, not needing to do any complex stats to prove that. That's what we're talking about with effect sizes, and that's how we then help apply these values to the real world. And it was this at all time points. And then they did what's called a subgroup analysis. We'll go into what a subgroup analysis is in a moment, but they found that it was effective at all time points, bar during eccentric exercise. So this be when the method of inducing muscular damage is to do with eccentric contractions, whether it be fast eccentric contractions, such as when you're changing direction in sport on a field, or, for example, when you're high load and above what would be considered you'd be able to physically lift, but you can control down on a bicep curl, for example. A kind of high intensity eccentric exercise. It wasn't effective for that, but it was effective for other forms of exercise in reducing the pain sensation. On average, it reduced it by about 16%. That's quite compelling, right? Next, we're on to that serum CK value, and this was only a small positive effect. Pardon me. It was a statistically significant effect, but it was only very small, 0.221. So again, not something that we'd want to base definitive, conclusions on. It's certainly something which we could investigate further. There was no subgroup analysis performed, however, due to something called low heterogeneity. Now, heterogeneity is another word for variance. It's variance in the data. No data set is exactly the same. Obviously, you've got a wide variety of participants, all different physical characteristics. You've got means and you've got standard deviations, to account for differences in people. All this is a measure of variance. If a data set has high heterogeneity, it's very variable. And so subgroup analysis can be performed to see where those variations are located. That's what allowed us, for example, to see that muscle soreness was not just blanketly effective, it was effective at all time points and bar the eccentric exercise. So that's how these subgroup analyses can help us identify where these variations in the data lie, where we're seeing these specific significant effects. This is often represented as I squared when you're reading it in the results section of a paper. That's all that means. If it's high heterogeneity, a subgroup analysis will typically be performed. If it's low heterogeneity, or if there's not enough studies to do a subgroup analysis, then it won't be performed. And there's always a limitation, potentially, of certain studies. Muscular strength, there was no significant improvement whatsoever, never returned to baseline or anything like that. And then muscular power, finally, there was a moderate significant improvement, a G-value of 0.597. And then subgroup analyses revealed positive effects at 24, 48, and 72 hours post-exercise with this cold water immersion. Also, despite, and this is where I'm getting into that point I just made a few seconds ago, despite high variance, even at 72 hours individually, there was not enough studies to do a subgroup analysis specifically at 72 hours to see whether it was with specific forms of exercise, a specific, muscle damaging routine that it was effective in reducing this for and not others. There was only 3 studies investigating it up to 72 hours. So the subgroup analysis was not performed. So the thing is with a meta-analysis, one of the biggest limitations of it is that you're always limited by the studies. It can only be as strong as the studies that are included in it. And every study will have limitations, and no study can answer all research questions ever, right? So when we get onto the discussion section, and if you're reading a paper, you'll soon find out that there's a structure that's consistent across pretty much all forms of scientific research, particularly randomized control trials. There's an introduction, or rather there's an abstract. There's an introduction where it lays out the topic and what they're going to be investigating. There's their methods, which is how they did it, everything from ethical approval to how they analyze the data. And then you've got your results section, which is the actual results of the statistical analysis, telling us exactly what I just told you now. Then you have the discussion section, which is where you start to discuss maybe how things work, how it fits into the overall evidence base, what evidence supports it, or what assertions does your paper support. Also, what contrasts with it and why, and we attempt to work out and fully understand the topic. Obviously, no study, no individual study will be able to do this on its own. That's why we call it a collective evidence base. So, they seem to find that cold water immersion reduces the inflammatory response post-exercise via a reduction in blood flow due to cold-induced vasoconstriction. This is where your blood vessels constrict and contract to allow less blood to go to your peripheral tissues so they can conserve more blood, more nutrients, and more heat for your core, which it will prioritize above all else. That's why your limbs and everything start shivering, or you start shivering to get warm, because it's all trying to restore homeostasis. But typically, or rather every time, your body will pull blood and constrict blood going to the peripheral tissues, your fingers, your toes, and then it will gradually get worse and worse and worse. This is a proposed mechanism of action of cold water immersion. Cold water immersion, or the cold, seems to be a potent analgesic as well. That's a painkiller. It has a potent painkilling effect, seemingly, evidenced by the reduction in DOMS at all time points. However, it was unclear as to what role the placebo effect played in the results. And the thing is about cold water immersion and other interventions like it is that there's no way to blind the participants to what intervention they are receiving. And as a result, the placebo effect is always going to be a potential problem. Think about it. There's no way for you to dunk somebody into cold water, give them a cold shower, or submerge their legs or whatever in cold water and not have them know that they're in cold water or that they're in the cold, what intervention they're receiving. It's not like, for example, we can test the efficacy of certain drugs, for example, by giving a certain population or certain sample the drug and giving a certain population a placebo, but they call it a placebo, which is just a sugar pill. But they think they're receiving the actual drug treatment. That's how we account for the placebo effect. That's called blinding. That's called blinding the participants to the intervention. It's very, very important. The only thing is, it's a constant limitation to big studies like these because it's impossible to do so. So always take that with a grain of salt as well. It's impossible to create a blind proof, or rather a placebo-proof condition when it comes to studies like these. But one proposed mechanism of action of these analgesic benefits might be as a result of, again, the cold-induced reduction in inflammation, also due to this reduction in peripheral blood flow. When your muscles are injured, when you have high levels of exercise-induced muscle damage, the body's natural response is inflammatory. The idea is for it to get increased blood flow, to get the nutrients and also the substrates in the body that result in the healing of these tissues to the area as quick as possible, so they can heal it as quick as possible and restore full functionality. Well, this reduction in peripheral blood flow has been thought to reduce what's called osmotic pressure of exudate. And this is the pressure, how can I phrase this? This is the pressure from fluid, and this is what exudate is, that seeps out of either blood vessels or organs into the interstitial space as a result of inflammation. Cold tends to reduce that. It reduces this fluid seeping out, which reduces the pressure, the osmotic pressure, on what we call nociceptors or nociceptors. I don't know how to pronounce it, but they are pain receptors. It reduces the pressure on these pain receptors, and so you may experience less pain sensation, as was thought to be one of the mechanisms of action behind this cold-induced pain-killing response. Cold-induced vasoconstriction is also thought to reduce the permeability of the cellular, lymphatic, and capillary vessels, which reduces this exudate diffusion into the interstitial space, which is again that space between cells, and this is believed to be the cause of the reduction in the inflammatory response. There we go. That's what I was trying to say. That's what I was trying to say. However, adiposity also heavily affects the rate of cooling. Think about it. You have higher levels of adiposity, higher levels of body fat. It's more tissue covering the muscle tissue. And so it takes longer and it takes more cold, basically. It's more energy to get through and result in the muscle cooling that may result in these changes. And it's, of course, we're concerned with cold water immersion implementation in different populations. And it could help explain why we observe different effects in certain populations and not others. Is adiposity is a major one. Again, like having a massive blanket over your legs, it's going to make getting your legs down to a cooler temperature a lot more difficult, sorry. As I said, cold water immersion was ineffective at restoring strength back to baseline within this study time frame. So that's a net negative for cold water immersion, particularly with strength. It just seems to be, based on this study at least, it seems to just be somewhat ineffective. It was able to restore muscular power, however, which was interesting because power and strength are quite closely related by the force-velocity relationship, the force-velocity curve. And this might be where there's a distinction in what elements of sporting performance cold water immersion can help out with. It might affect different areas of the force-velocity relationship. So strength is the ability to generate force. You think about force as being right at the top of a curve and acceleration being right there down at the bottom, or mass and acceleration. You can train for all of them, and there's a spectrum of different ways you can train in between. That's what we call it, the force-velocity curve. So it may help with other areas outside, based on this data, outside of maximal strength. It might help with rate of force development, which is speed strength. It might help with maximal velocity, just pure speed training. It might help with other elements that are not specifically generating maximal force. So it's interesting. It's interesting that cold water immersion was able to aid in some areas of the stretch shortening cycle, but not in others. It may also be due to perceiving less pain. And so you can, for one maximal involuntary contraction on a force pad, jumping as high as you can temporarily jump a little bit higher. Whereas if you hadn't had that, you'd still have that fibrosis and that pain sensation. So It's unclear, but that might be some of the potential mechanisms by how cold water immersion was able to help restore muscular power. And this is where everything comes in. It's nuanced. Everything is nuanced in science. It's very, very rarely a black and white. This is bad, this is good, etc. Same is true in nutrition. It's true in training. In many, many ways to skin a cat, as we say. They also speculated as to whether cold water immersion recovery is preferential to type 2 fibers, which will be the fibers that are mostly doing the work when it comes to very explosive, high force production, high power activities. What else have we got here? Oh, yeah. And it just says that mechanisms weren't fully elucidated at the time. And finally, however, other studies, and there's two which I'm going to link down in the show notes below. One of them is by Fonseca and colleagues, and the other was by Takeda and colleagues. They seem to show that either cold water immersion is not effective when they looked at it in a group of rugby players, for example, on these markers, or is only positive at 24 hours post while being detrimental immediately after. And that might be due to the reduction in muscle temperature, which is also going to have a net negative impact on other elements of sporting performance. Because think about it, why do you do a warm-up? If you do a warm-up, you're going to perform better. Your muscles have increased elasticity. They're able to generate more force because they're at a more optimal temperature. Reducing that temperature is probably going to result in decreased performance immediately after, but it might help in acute performance on the next day. So again, a very, very nuanced topic. I'd advise you go read those studies below. But they also highlighted the potential role of what we call hydrostatic pressure, which is the pressure basically that's exerted on you by the water. And they highlighted that displacement of gas from areas of high pressure, which is those down by the ankles, to areas of low pressure at the water surface, can induce a sort of quote-unquote squeezing effect that induces alterations in the fluid within the intracellular, interstitial, and intravascular spaces, which is thought to lead to reduced edema, which is swelling caused by fluid accumulation caused by strenuous exercise. So that's another unclear area, how much of the actual hydrostatic pressure is involved in potential positive outcomes with water immersion as a whole. And it's something which we look at when we look at cold water immersion strategies that have only immersed one or both legs in water, or only immersed an exercised arm in water. The effect is still currently unclear. But in conclusion, they found that cold water immersion was effective at reducing DOMS after exercise at all time points, like I said, and also muscular power was positively improved. Strength, however, was not benefited. So, there's a lot to take in there. There's going to be a lot to take in as we go through even more studies in a minute. Because we're going to start delving deep into the world of strength and hypertrophy molecular mechanisms in a minute, and showing, pardon me, why cold water immersion may be a very detrimental strategy. So now we're looking at a study or publication from Roberts and colleagues, and this came out in 2015, so 3 years later. It's a little bit more up to date. Pardon me. They did a series of 2 randomized controlled trials. They done a study, and then they done a follow-up study, and we'll understand why they did that in a moment. They done one aimed at strength and hypertrophy, and then they done one aimed at molecular mechanisms of hypertrophy. The aim was to investigate the effects of cold water immersion on strength and hypertrophy. And then the second study was to understand the molecular responses to cold, which may help explain the effects from the first study. So, study 1. Strength and whole muscle hypertrophy. This was a randomized controlled trial, i.e., they had 24 physically active males. However, 3 of them withdrew due to injury not associated with the study before the study's conclusion. When this happens, you tend to just disregard their data. It's unfortunate. It happens. Another thing that happens in studies is that people drop out. As a result, you can't use their data because it's an incomplete data set. So 3 of them withdrew due to injury not associated with the study. 1 of them in the cold water immersion group, and 2 of them in what's called an active recovery group. So the way it worked is they had the active recovery group, which ended up having 10 participants, and the cold water immersion, the experimental group, ended up having 11. And they completed a progressive resistance training program, which was 2 times a week for 12 weeks, aimed at the lower body. So they done various exercises from the leg press to knee extensions to knee flexions for your hamstrings, walking lunges, and plyometric exercises. Again, you can go and read the citation for the full program breakdown that they done for the 2 studies. The cold water immersion condition was 10 minutes at 10 degrees C water only up to the waist. Because they done a lower body training program only, they immersed the lower body. Active recovery was 10 minutes post-exercise, and these were both post-exercise, by the way, within 5 minutes of completing each exercise session, at a self-selected low intensity on a cycle ergometer, which is a watt bike. Cycle, obviously bicycle, and ergometer just means a meter that measures work. Anyway, that's just what a watt bike is. It's what any machine in the gym is. A treadmill is a running ergometer. There you go. So we're going into the results section. So both groups gained muscle mass as a result of the training program. The active recovery group gained on average about 309 grams, plus or minus 73. Obviously, within this short time frame, you're not looking at kilograms of difference and stuff like that. You're not looking at that whatsoever, especially in naturally trained individuals. And then cold water immersion, they ended up gaining 103. And both of these were significant. These were significant gains in muscle hypertrophy, or muscle mass rather. However, as you can probably guess, if you've just done the numbers in your head, muscle mass was much higher in the active recovery therapy group by an average of 206 grams. This was a very, very significant change, or very, very significant difference. Again, the effect size would show us that it's something you could probably see in a visual comparison. And then also the type 2 and total muscle cross-sectional area, which is, think about it, that's the area of the muscle that you can see. Think about that. Looking at it, when you look at it, think, oh, wow, that person has big muscles. You're seeing the muscle cross-sectional area. This only increased in the active recovery group. On average, the type 2 muscle cross-sectional area increased 17.1%. And in total, that plus type 1 muscle fibers that added another 14.2%. The cold water immersion group did not significantly increase either of these variables. The number of myonuclei per fiber in both type 2 and total fibers only increased in the ACT group, the active recovery group also. That's very, very important. When we're looking at hypertrophy, one of the dominant mechanisms of hypertrophy is the action of satellite cells, or I think they're called acquiescent stem cells, I think is what they're called. So like cells that are dormant, but then when a certain stimulus is applied to the muscle, they proliferate, they differentiate, and as a result, they help form new myofilaments within the muscle. Myofilaments are the proteins that result in muscle contraction. As a result, you have a lot of those new myofilaments being acted. You have a bigger muscle, a bigger bundle of muscle fibers. You have a bigger muscle fiber. You have muscle hypertrophy. And give it like that. As I said, this was only significantly increased in the active recovery group. On average, type 2 muscle fiber myonuclei number increased about 26%. And then the total was increased by about 17%. Again, there was no significant increases in the cold water immersion group. Now, this is very, very important. I'm just going to tick these off as I go along. Strength. We'll get into a little bit about more of this in the discussion section in a bit. Strength as measured by 1 rep max increased in both groups for the leg press. The active recovery group ended up at about 201 kilos, plus or minus 65. And the cold water immersion group increased by about 133 kilos, plus or minus 43. Both of them were significant. Both of them were significant. And the knee extensors also increased significantly in both groups. On average, about 34 kilos in the active recovery and about 17, 18 kilos in the cold water immersion. However, these were significantly greater in the active recovery group versus the cold water immersion group. This gives us a difference in leg press of about 57 kilos, which is a D value, which is another effect size value of 1.5, very large in magnitude. And then the knee extensor as well, a difference of 15.6 kilograms in knee extensor, quadriceps 1 rep max is what I meant to say, with a 1.4 effect size value, again, very large in magnitude. So again, you'd be able to point out that that person is a lot stronger than the other person. And that's what we're observing when we're looking at this active recovery versus cold water immersion. The rate of force development, as you know, we touched on this a couple of minutes ago. The rate of force development impulse increased in both groups and is measured in newtons per second. However, it was significantly greater in the active recovery group compared to the cold water immersion group. And the same story was true for maximal isometric torque, which is basically your maximal force production on something like a knee extensor when they prohibit your leg from moving. They put a resistance against your leg that prohibits your leg from moving. Think about it. The resistance they have to put on your leg or against your leg to stop your leg from moving is going to be directly proportional to the maximal amount of force that your leg muscle can generate. It's like a little bit about how we measure ground reaction force to measure how much of a runner's body weight is going through their 1 foot when they land. Stuff like that. So that's study 1. Study 2 then looked at the molecular responses. So they had 10 young males in this time, and one of them had to withdraw again due to injury, not associated with the study whatsoever. They all completed 2 bouts of single leg exercise on separate days, one day receiving cold water immersion on the leg and the other receiving no intervention. So this is where another type of study allows the participants to serve as their own controls, which is also useful. If you have a low participant number, to split a group into 5 and 4 or 5 and 5, it might harm your statistical power in some way, whereas you can get the participants to serve as their own controls, depending on what sort of study you're doing. So all of them, as I said, they all completed 2 bouts of single leg exercise and received the same cold water intervention after one and no intervention or active recovery on the same cycle ergometer after the other. It was a unilateral leg press, single leg squat, unilateral knee extension, and a walking lunge. Those were the 4 exercises they used in this program. So it was quite similar to the other one, just targeted at one leg. Also, in both of these trials, participants minimized immediate rewarming or cooling after their exercise and after their cold water immersion. They were instructed instead to sit around and warm up naturally. They did not shower or bathe to warm up, for example, after cold water immersion, until at least 2 hours after a muscle biopsy was taken. It's because obviously it would have drastically influenced the results if they instead jumped out of the cold water bath and went straight into the shower, a hot shower, before their measurement could be taken of their vastus lateralis muscle. We'll get into that in a minute. Obviously, it's going to result in that result being completely useless. So, muscle biopsies collected from the vastus lateralis, which is a muscle of the quads, before and after each session. And that will allow us to see differences in molecular signals of muscle hypertrophy and stuff like that, as we'll get into in a moment. They looked at key proteins and anabolic signalers in this country on the microscopic scale. They looked at something called P7OS6 kinase, different variations of this particular signaler of muscle hypertrophy in humans. This is part of what we call the AKT mammalian target of rapamycin hypertrophy pathway. What that means is thought to be a master regulator. You can go and see the paper I'll link below by Schoenfeld that goes through these mechanisms. Thought to be the master regulator of muscle hypertrophy in humans. AKT stimulates this mTOR pathway, which in turn sets off a cascade of anabolic processes and resulting ultimately in muscle growth, all different hormones, testosterone, growth hormone, etc. The AKT mTOR pathway is thought to have anabolism promoting and potent catabolic inhibiting properties. So that's why they look at things that would be indicative of changes in this pathway. They also looked at, again, I mentioned them a little while ago, the satellite cells expressing something called neural cell adhesion molecule, or NCAM, NCAM, and satellite cells expressing paired boxing protein, or paired box protein rather, PAX7 it's called. Just call it PAX7. Satellite cells, as I said, are essential precursors for muscle hypertrophy. as I said, they proliferate, they differentiate, and then they fuse with the muscle fibers, donating myonuclei, muscle nuclei, the myofilaments, to basically adapt to the stimulus that has been imposed. The stimulus that is imposed has been decidedly by the body too much for it to handle. As a result, it needs to adapt. Satellite cells give myonuclei. As a result, there's more things to basically contract. The muscle gets a little bit stronger. It also gets a little bit bigger. That's the theory. Okay? Whew. It's a deep dive. So, when we're looking at the results, the protein that I mentioned, I'm just going to call it PK for now. P kinase, whatever, the P7OS6K, significantly increased 2 hours post in both trials. They remained higher at 24 hours versus pre-exercise and tended to be higher 48 hours post-exercise in the active recovery. Now, a tendency in stats is basically when, as I said, that p-value that we were looking at when we looked at the previous meta-analysis, that significance value of 0.05, basically 5% chance that, less than a 5% chance, if it's less than that number, of what we are observing is due to confounding or random chance or anything like that. Gloriously oversimplifying it, but I'm not a statistician. A tendency is when it comes in just above that value, just above. Here we're looking at 0.068. So that's where we're on the verge of seeing a statistically significant outcome or statistically significant relationship, but we can't say 100 definitive %. That's what this tendency is. It's useful for informing us. It's useful for highlighting potential relationships. And it's the strongest stat value that you can have without it going over into statistical significance. But it's depressing. When you see one of these, I had a tendency in my dissertation. It's depressing. It's really, really depressing. But it is what it is. But that was only at 48 hours. And while we're looking at the levels of this hormone, or this cytokine, that were higher 2 hours post, it was 3.6-fold increase in the active recovery condition, 2.2-fold increase in the cold water immersion condition, and then at 24 hours it was 2-fold, and then at 48 hours it was 1.8-fold, and that was in the active recovery condition. This meant that this phosphorylation of this molecule, or this signaler of muscle hypertrophy, was much higher at 2 and 24 hours versus the cold water immersion condition. Looking at 90% for 2 hours, that's very, very high effect size. Very, obviously, a person wouldn't be able to spot this looking at another person, but you're looking at these values and you're looking at this through a microscope, you'd be able to see significant differences. And then at 24 hours, it was 60% with another higher effect size of 5.3. So it was a similar story for the other markers, bar the protein variant of this particular molecule, which was only significantly higher 48 hours post in the ACT trial only. It was 1.3-fold higher, or 30%. Oh, then we're looking at these PAX7 cells. PAX7, they increased from pre-exercise values at 24 hours. By 21% and 48% at 48 hours. Oh, how nice is that? In the ACT condition, the active recovery condition, but not cold water immersion at any time point. They didn't have it at any time point, and that's going to be very, very important. Pardon me. Yeah, so we're looking at a 33% increase for ACT versus cold water immersion. The satellite cells expressing that NCAM, or that neural cell adhesion molecule, they were increased above pre-exercise values at all time points, ranging between 10 and 32%, whereas no significant changes occurred in the cold water immersion trial until 48 hours post-exercise. They did see it start to come back up significantly 48 hours post-exercise. They come back to about 9.5% increase. So, and then the NCAM cell count was also significantly higher in the active recovery therapy. As we tell, I'm not used to doing podcast episodes on stuff like this for this long. in the active recovery therapy versus the cold water immersion therapy 24 hours post-exercise. Again, about 90%. So yes, very, very significant. So let's move on to the discussion. So what they concluded from this was that cold water immersion appears to attenuate long-term gains in muscle mass and strength, and also suppresses anabolic signaling for up to 2 days. That's what we observed literally just now with the neural cell adhesion molecule satellite cells being suppressed for 48 hours afterwards. So, and this is part of an emerging theme that, as well as other recovery strategies such as non-steroidal, non-steroid anti-inflammatory drugs and antioxidant supplements, that they may be counterproductive when it comes to mitigating and improving resilience to training and physiological stress as a means to promote strength and hypertrophic adaptation. The contrasting literature which they listed seemed to revolve more around maintaining adaptations. And this will be a little bit of a theme that we get onto at the end of this episode anyway, rather than enhancing or promoting. So it's not saying you can't, it has a detrimental effect in that you're going to lose muscle using cold water immersion. That's not what we saw at all, because obviously the cold water immersion group gained muscle, just saying they would have gained more if they hadn't used the cold water immersion strategy. So that's a good take. That's a big takeaway as well. So we do have the question of whole body versus waist submersion, as they only immerse to the waist. There's been another study that looked at a full body training program and found that cold water immersion may not adversely affect strength outcomes. They didn't find significant detriments or attenuations in strength. However, they did see a similar response with regards to muscle hypertrophy and these cellular signals with regards to anabolism. Anabolism is another word for growth, by the way, muscle growth. And anabolic equals growth, catabolic equals breakdown. So muscle is constantly going through these cycles of growth and breakdown. There's certain molecules within our muscles that promote breakdown. There's certain molecules that promote growth. Ultimately, what muscle growth comes from is a net balance in favor of growth over breakdown. There's no way to completely get rid of breakdown, and it may be counterproductive if you want to anyway. That's what the training process is. Training results in the breakdown of muscle. However, it's the maximizing the growth factors then in the recovery period that allow us to get bigger and stronger over time. So breakdown is a natural thing and is a key part of the process to muscle growth. But yeah, they found that during full body resistance training, again, I'll have this link below as well, they immersed up to the sternum in a seated position. And they said, as I said, they didn't find an attenuation in strength. So again, it's unclear whether that has something to do with the difference in hydrostatic pressure or anything like that. Still currently not sure. That's the thing. There's a lot of questions, as I said, in science that science doesn't necessarily have all the answers right now. We don't have all the answers to all the world's questions, but future research is going to inform, and future reading on my part is going to inform. In future episodes of this, we'll probably be coming back and revisiting some of these topics with more things that I've learned. And that's the whole thing. It's constant learning. We learn until we die. And the question is, as I said, could it have been down to the difference in muscle temperature with greater or less immersion in the cold, i.e. the legs get acutely colder because they were the only ones immersed in the study from Roberts, but in the other study, they immersed up to the sternum. So there was greater dissipation of the water. I've no idea. I have absolutely no idea. And it's okay to admit that you don't know things as well, by the way. It's okay to admit that you don't know things. It just means you need to read and learn more. That's all it means. It did make a valid assertion, however, in this other study it's by Fife et al., and it came out in 2019. A valid assertion is that cold water immersion alongside repeated resistance training sessions over long periods of time may exacerbate the negative effects. So, this assertion makes sense, as the athlete will likely be training again in the period where the anabolic response is suppressed. But athletes don't just train twice a week. You train 5, 6, maybe 7 days a week. You're doing something every day. The mixed martial arts athletes where I train, for example, some days they'll just be doing their cardio. Some days they're doing double sessions. They've got their S&C like in the early afternoon, and they've got their sparring in the evening. They've got jiu-jitsu. They've got everything. So they're doing multiple sessions. So they're still going to be training in this time where their anabolic response is compromised. So that's not necessarily going to be a massive implication for mixed martial arts athletes, but those doing very, very high training volumes and very, very high frequency resistance training routines, elite bodybuilders, they'll be likely very negatively affected by this. So again, this is why it's context dependent on who you are and what your goals are. They also seem to find a higher level of protein degradation indicators. So this is indicated by a protein called FOX01 or FOX-01. And this is an indication, when this is high, it's a sign potentially that protein degradation is high, that muscle degradation is high. So again, may have a little bit of a catabolic effect. We don't know. There's other studies that seem to have shown no difference in anabolic and catabolic hormones. We'll be going over one of those studies now in a minute. They also speculate that the increasing levels of what we call myoplasmic adenosine monophosphate as a result of cold exposure may influence the activity of another mechanism called AMPK. This AMPK, again, you can read this down below, has been shown to inhibit muscle protein synthesis through various mechanisms through the mechanistic target of rapamycin complex 1. I'm not going too far into that today, but just to let you know, this is a mechanism of muscle protein synthesis. Muscle protein synthesis is the take-up of amino acids in the bloodstream into the muscle in order to synthesize protein from it and build muscle from those amino acid precursors. So inhibiting this is going to have a net negative on muscle hypertrophy and the amount of amino acids that are being uptaken into the muscle. We're going to get onto a specific study looking at in a minute. And that was it for this study. So those conclusions, the anabolic response blunted and long-term gains in muscle mass and strength were blunted, attenuated as well. So this is really not good. They're really not good, particularly if you're a strength or a hypertrophy athlete. You may want to start reconsidering your use of cold water immersion on a regular basis. Or if you're even just a person who wants to be as muscular as possible, you may want to start reconsidering your use of cold water immersion. And it's specifically cold water immersion. Okay, it's unclear whether a cold shower for 30 seconds in the morning just to get you up ready for work is going to have, make you shrink away into nothing. So, as I say, if you enjoy that kind of thing, keep doing it. But regular cold water immersion may be having a net negative if your goals revolve around hypertrophy, strength, etc. So, now we're on to a very, very important study with what we just talked about. It's a study by Kaz Fuchs and colleagues. And it is a randomized controlled trial, came out in 2020, where, again, participants served as their own controls. So the aim was to investigate the effect of post-exercise cooling, again, as a result of water immersion. And the water was a little bit colder than some of the other studies have used. They used 8-degree water on muscle protein synthesis rates, on the rate of muscle protein synthesis. So they got 12 young males, recreational gym experience. They do 3 sessions per week, a total of about 4.5 hours of exercise per week. However, they're not engaged in, a structured resistance training program with a certain outcome that they're training for. They're not athletes or anything like that. These are just, everyday people that go to the gym, basically. They use various methods to analyze muscle protein synthesis rates. They use something called deuterated water or deuterium oxide infused in water. This was to measure more chronic rates of muscle protein synthesis over 2 weeks. And they also used a continuous infusion of amino acids on one day, continuous intravenous infusion on one day, which they designated as an infusion day, to measure the muscle protein synthesis rates hour by hour with muscle protein with cold water immersion. So, and by the way, this method of using it over 2 weeks, this deuterated water method, is very, very reliable method. It's also important to comment on the validity and reliability of the methods used as well. So, resistance training sessions were completed on non-consecutive days. They ended up doing 7 sessions over the 2-week period, all of which were about 4 sets, 8 to 10 reps, 80% 1 rep max, and they progressed as necessary. They also took measurements of bodily fluids, saliva, and blood samples before some of the sessions as well. They took saliva before every session, and at various points they took blood samples on the infusion day as well. Saliva and blood samples on the infusion day at various points. They didn't take blood samples every single session though. And then one leg served as the trial condition. and the other leg served as the control condition. So one leg of the participants served as the trial leg, which received the cold water immersion. It was 8 degrees water for 20 minutes. And the other one was immersed in thermoneutral water, which is 30 degrees for 20 minutes. Basically, imagine them like stood. Oh God, no, I kicked the camera. Stood or sat in a bath, one side of which, both of which are separated. One side is cold, one side is warm. Think of it like that. Immediately post-immersion, a beverage containing 20 grams of milk protein and 45 grams of a carbohydrate blend mixing maltodextrin and dextrose was given to them. Again, this is so post-exercise, they've got something that's going to stimulate muscle protein synthesis so they can analyze fractional synthetic rate. And the carbohydrate is there because it stimulates the production of insulin or the secretion of insulin, which is going to help in amino acid uptake into muscles because insulin stimulates nutrient uptake into cells. That's why they include that carbohydrate in there. So, muscle biopsies were also taken at various time points on the infusion day. They were taken at baseline, 2 and at 5 hours. This infusion day lasted all in all about 7 hours. They were hooked up to the IV for about 5 hours, 5-6 hours, thereabouts. As well as on the last training trial day. So a muscle biopsy again is where they make an incision into the muscle, they take a small bit of it out basically, and they freeze it so they can analyze it later. That's what they do. The researchers, and this is an important point to make, they also made sure to try and mitigate any confounding by inflammation. If you think about it, they're making an incision and taking part of the muscle out is an injury. So there's going to be a natural inflammatory response. They tried to account for this by making sure that the muscle biopsies were taken greater than 3 centimeters apart. So this was very, very good. They weren't negligent or just taking muscle from wherever. They were very, very systematic in how they took these biopsies, which is very, very important. So then the results from this. There was a significant time and treatment effect. So this is where we're looking at the effect of the intervention proposed in itself in what we call myofibrillar. So think of myofibrillar, myo muscle, fibrillar fiber, myofiber, muscle fiber, amino acid enrichment in both conditions. So there was significant increases in this enrichment at 0 to 2 hours in both conditions and at 5 hours. And there were no significant differences in the time period of 2 hours between cold water immersion and the control condition. There was no significant difference between the two in terms of this amino acid enrichment up to 2 hours. However, there was a difference at 5 hours with the control condition being significantly higher. There was a strong effect size, again indicating a strong and noticeable difference, and it was significant. Then we're looking at something called fractional synthetic rate. So now we're looking at the actual rate of muscle protein synthesis across this time frame. Again, no significant differences between the two at up to 2 hours. However, we are looking, and this was with both forms of tracer, sorry, I should make that clear. They use 2 amino acids in this tracer, in this infusion. They use phenylalanine and they use leucine. There was no differences in either at 2 hours between the control and the cold water immersion condition. However, there was a significant difference in both tracers at 5 hours, with the control condition having significantly higher levels of fractional synthetic rate, higher levels of muscle protein synthesis than the cold water immersion condition. And these effect sizes were, again, large in magnitude. So this is very, very important. So, going further to that, across the 2-week period, so that's the infusion data, looking at this deuterated water data, they also showed a reflected lower muscle protein synthesis rate across the cold water immersion condition than the control condition. In my notes here, there was quite a bit of difference. In the control condition, it was an average of about 1.67 plus or minus, up to about 2% per day. Pardon me. The cold water condition on average was sitting at about 1.5. So when you run the stats, this was a moderate effect size, a moderate negative reduction in muscle protein synthesis with the cold water immersion. They also observed suppression of the P70SK phosphorylation that we mentioned earlier with the Robert study, and that was at 5 hours. However, there was no significant differences in any other key proteins involved in translation, in protein translation, and in protein formation, basically. So when we're looking at this study, it demonstrated that post-exercise cooling and reductions in muscle temperature seem to blunt muscle protein synthesis fractional synthetic rate. That's what I meant to say. I've got my letters mixed up on my notes. This results in less dietary derived, so protein coming in through your diet, less dietary derived amino acids being taken up within cells for muscle protein synthesis, and as such, a diminished muscle protein synthesis response. Also, when this was assessed over long periods of time, we found that this regular cold water immersion regularly suppressed and resulted in chronic suppression of muscle protein synthesis. It also adds to the previous research in the potential anabolic blunting of anabolic signaling. However, as I said, some of the other molecules which they looked at, some of the other things that they looked at didn't show significant changes between conditions. So this is why it's important to exercise nuance and understand that that one study that we looked at before may not explain the full picture. As a result, this is where we can start comparing and contrasting the literature. It's very, very important to be able to think critically on things like this and not jump to conclusions. The reduction in muscle temperature was about 5 degrees, and this seemed to translate into a 26% lowering of dietary-derived amino acid uptake into muscle tissue. That's very, very significant. And post-prandial, so post-food, post-eating, myofibrillar synthetic rate reduced by almost 20% over the entire 5-hour period that they were under the infusion for. As I said, however, there were no key changes or reductions in the key hormones and kinases involved in the protein translation, aside from that one we mentioned. There was no significant changes in certain catabolic hormones either, and they looked at that FOXO1 protein that we looked at earlier, so this is a little bit confusing. They did say one potential mechanism for this reduced amino acid uptake may be that some markers of amino acid transport, and these are two markers that are designated SN82 and CD98. They were significantly lower in the cold water immersion leg. Another may be the reduced blood flow resultant from the temperature decrease. This could potentially diminish blood supply and as a result diminish amino acid uptake. The extent that each plays in the role of this decrease in dietary derived uptake into muscle of protein and amino acids is unclear. And it's unclear as if this is the full picture. And again, this is where we need, every study is going to need a future study to basically corroborate its results 9 times out of 10. But the conclusion being, individuals aiming to improve, and this is directly from their keynote section, their key points at the start of the paper, individuals aiming to improve skeletal muscle conditioning should reconsider using cooling or applying cooling as part of their post-exercise recovery strategy. So, we have potential benefits for cold water immersion. However, it doesn't seem to be beneficial to recovering strength, potential attenuation of strength, and anabolic signaling of muscle and lean mass gains, and diminished muscle protein synthesis rates. In terms of accruing muscle mass and accruing muscular strength, this is not looking good for cold water immersion. However, we're not finished just yet. We're going to look at one more paper mainly and a couple of other papers, or one other paper really, within this paper to explain maybe the role of muscle temperature in this cold water immersion strategy, and basically answer the question, does colder mean better? So this is another randomized controlled trial by Vera and colleagues, and this came out in 2016, and the aim was to investigate the effect of water temperature on performance and markers of exercise-induced muscle damage using cold water immersion. So they had 42 college-aged males. I would imagine it's the American college, which is like university-age males. 3 experimental conditions. So they had cold water immersion at 5 degrees. They had cold water immersion at 15 degrees, and then they had a control group, which was no intervention, and each group had 14 people. They had 4 outcome variables of interest. So they looked at muscular strength, they looked at muscular power, they looked at muscle soreness, and they looked at their serum creatine kinase again. The exercise protocol, and this is near and dear to my heart, this is the exact same exercise protocol that we used in the dissertation that I did for my undergrad. Me and another student by the name of Georgia, we used this exact exercise protocol, which is very, very effective at inducing exercise-induced muscle damage, which is a set of 20 drop jumps repeated 5 times with 2 minutes rest in between sets. Yeah, we did this. It was the university netball team. Some girls with the university netball team we done our dissertation in, looking at markers of recovery and muscle damage, but in the context of using heat as a recovery modality instead of cold. So this is very, very similar to what we did, just again with cold instead of heat. And yeah, they done this protocol to induce exercise-induced muscle damage. It's very effective. And then they use a recovery intervention, as I said, 5 degrees for 20 minutes up to the waist, 15 degrees for 20 minutes up to the waist, and no intervention. So the results, the maximal strength did not return to baseline for the entire study time frame. Oh, sorry, until 168 hours post-exercise. This was a slightly longer duration study. 168, that's like a week, if I'm not mistaken. A week, maybe slightly longer. Muscular power did drop after the exercise, as you can imagine. As I said, this was designed to basically decrease further performance so we could see the effectiveness of a recovery modality. But the 5 degrees centigrade group and the control group experienced a secondary drop in performance at 48 hours. So basically what happened is, if you imagine a graph, their performance came down a little bit, and then at 24 hours, and then at 48 hours, it came down again. Whereas from 24 hours in the 15 degrees centigrade group, we experienced then a linear, sorry, we didn't experience, they experienced, sorry, a linear increase, a linear recovery in performance back up to baseline near enough by 24 hours. Sorry, not by 24 hours, by 72 hours. So at 72 hours, the results, or rather the counter movement jump data, was not significant from baseline in the 15 degrees centigrade condition only. The 5 degrees centigrade group did not come back to baseline, or not significantly below baseline, until 96 hours, until a full day later. That tells us that 15 degrees C group recovered muscle power to baseline quicker. Now that's interesting. And then the control group did not fully recover their power output back to baseline within the set time frame of the study. And then both cold water immersion conditions seem to reduce the sensation of DOMS greater than the control condition did. So this is quite interesting. So it indicates that water temperature may play a vital role in the definition and prescription of cold water immersion as a recovery aid, and shows that colder doesn't always mean better. This is supported also by evidence from a study by Horgan and colleagues from this year, who looked at a study of professional male rugby players. They used cold water immersion after their resistance training sessions at 15 degrees centigrade, and they did not seem to attenuate or promote. So they weren't beneficial to gains in lean mass, and this was the measure they were looking at, lean mass. But they also didn't attenuate them. So they gained mass as a result of the intervention, and it didn't seem that cold water immersion negatively affected that growth. They used a DEXA scan to validate this, and it was good. They pointed out a vital aspect, which is a limitation of this study, and all studies have limitations. This being that DEXA is less sensitive than other body composition measurements to changes in lean mass, because lean mass is quite a broad term. Lean mass is anything that is not fat mass. So fat mass is your adipose tissue. Lean mass is anything that is not adipose tissue. It's skeletal muscle. It's your organs. It's fluid mass. It's bone mass. It's everything. And DEXA is quite limited when it comes to differentiating between all these different things. So, and they correctly asserted that a follow-up study looking at site-specific things with something like an MRI or a CT scan would be very, very beneficial to aid in further improving, further educating on whether this is effective, just beyond the measurement tool of a DEXA scan. A DEXA scan is very, very good though. So yeah, but this concluded then, water temp may play a very important role in the application of cold water immersion, and also that warmer may be better. This is the last line from their abstract. Warmer may be better than colder. So that should give you quite a lot of information about cold water immersion, what it is, why it's used, all stuff like that, a little bit about how it works. And then also when maybe you use it and when you wouldn't want to use it. In terms of muscle strength and muscle hypertrophy, if you have any goals regarding these, I would personally stay away from long-term repeated use of cold water immersion for the reasons we've gone over today. The attenuation of muscle strength and muscle mass observed in the Roberts et al. Study, the suppression of muscle protein synthesis for 48 hours post, everything like that, I would recommend personally staying away from, as I said, repeated use of post-exercise cold water immersion. However, this may need to do with what goals you have in mind, but if you enjoy it, if it improves your quality of life, if you're less serious about goals such as these, you're more so just concerned with, overall longevity, you don't go to the gym to, be the best, so to speak. You just enjoy exercise just for what it is. You just mainly focused on doing what you can to live a long time and stuff like that. And you may enjoy cold water immersion. You may bought a cold water immersion tub and you may just enjoy it. You may like the feeling of sitting in cold water. You may feel as though it gives you that buzz of dopamine. You may feel subjectively that it makes you feel better. It may line up well with the rest of your overall life and give you that something to look forward to every day. Those are all valid reasons. You don't have to take this and then say you have to completely swear off cold water immersion forever. Just be aware of what the evidence says, and that if you have a goal revolving around achieving most muscle hypertrophy and most strength that you can, cold water immersion may be detrimental to you. Regular use of cold water immersion may be detrimental to you. Understand that maybe just turn the heating on a little bit. If you enjoy sitting in a bath, just turn the heating on a little bit. Just don't make it cold. If you're another athlete, if you do a lot of training and just want to feel recovered for your next training session, of course, if you want to use it, use it. If it makes you feel better, use it. I'm not saying not to use it. I'm saying there may be context dependent on whether you may want to use it and if it's going to benefit you. So, that's it for today's episode, guys. It's a very, very long episode. My voice is killing me. But I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. I'm sorry for all the times I stumbled over my words and stuff like that. As you can tell, this is my first time doing like a really long-form scientific deep dive episode like this. I did enjoy it. Admittedly, I'm very, very nervous. Yeah. The nervous on the case of I've never done this before, but I have very, very much enjoyed this. And I feel it's going to be very, very useful to a lot of you. So yeah. Hope you have a great day, guys. Go train hard. And I will catch you again very, very soon. Out.